Again, so we are traveling through the Word, and we're going to do our first book of the Bible for 2022. And as you can see at the top, it says Finding Life in the Word. Okay? Because that's where life is found, in the Word. So this month, our travels will be through the book of Job. So for this screen recording, I'm going to give you a lot of background on the book of Job. Okay? So when I get ready to go into the topic, you'll have this background information because you can study Job however your heart desires. But I want you to have the background information as you're studying it. And so let's just start talking about Job. So here's some background. Job, the Hebrew meaning of his name is persecution. So it was like persecuted one. The Arabic, that should be Arabic, but okay. Meaning is to repent. All right, the book author, there's lots of speculation on who authored the book, but there's none 100% agreed on by scholars, okay? And then the land of Uz, which they talk about, where Job was south of Edom and west of Arabia, extending into the border of Chaldea. Job is considered to include a great amount of narrative text, and we talked about that earlier, remember? That's why they put it there, because it has a lot of narrative text in it. In Job's day, wealth was determined by the animals that you own, because that's what nomadic people worked with. The book of Job, interesting, is known as one of the oldest books in the Bible. It was written before the law of Moses. Now, just because it's not in the Bible like that, it's like not the first one, doesn't mean it was the first one written. Wasn't the first one written. It took place in the latter part of the 430-year period of the promise. You can find that in Genesis 15 and 13. Job died literally about 15 years before the Exodus from Egypt. Job was around 70 when his trials began, and he lived 140 years after that. And just something to remember that Job lived before the giving of the law. So before Moses gave the law, Job had already lived during that time, before that time. And just some brief statistics. It's the 18th book of the Bible. When you look at how they're, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, like that. When you look at how they're written, the order that they're written, the order that they're bound in the Bible as. It's the 18th book. Has 42 chapters, 1,070 verses. There's 1,066 verses of history. There's one verse of fulfilled prophecy, 3 verses of unfulfilled prophecy. You have 329 questions, 13 commands, 10 messages from God, and 4 predictions. Okay? So that's some of the first part of the background. All right? And then if we go on, remember I told you, so you might want to do a quick screenshot of the pages as I go through them, or you could just kind of go back and look at it again, up to you. And so when you're looking at the doctrine that's in the book of Job, okay, thinking about Elohim, the supreme being, okay, mentioned 16 times. El, God being the strong one, the almighty, okay, discussed at least 54 times. Eloi is the living God. It's about 41 times in there. Jehovah, meaning the Lord, 31 times in there. And Adonai, meaning the Lord, is found 1 time in there. Okay. Other information about, Job is they mention a 4-fold character of Job. This is what God said when, the book first opens up. God says that Job is perfect. Now, not sinless like Jesus, but rather free from guile and evil intentions. That's what, he meant when he did it. Job was upright. He feared God, and he eschewed evil. All right. Job's 4-fold state, as he was going through everything that was happening. At one point, he was weary of life. One while he was complaining, one while he was bitter, and then he, had the nerve to even make accusations against God. But when you're struggling and suffering and pain, you've lost everything, and your whole body is filled with sores, and not just little sores, but sores that had pulse coming from them. You might get a little antsy. Might lose your mind for a little bit there. All right. And then three of the friends that were mentioned at first, the ones that first mentioned with Job, the one that came and sat with him, there was Eliphaz. He was a Temanite. Temanite. He was connected to Esau and Edom. All right. The Temanites were known for their wisdom. All right. He argued from the standpoint of human experience. Okay, we'll talk more about that when we get into Job. The four chapters he was in was 4, 5, 15, and 22. And then there was Bildad. He was a Shuhite connected to the Shuah. He was the youngest son of Abraham. He argued from the standpoint of human traditions. All right. Here's 3 chapters where you can find him talking. There's chapters 8 to 18 and 25. All right. And then you have Zophar. He was a Namathite, connected to Naamah on the southern frontier of Judah. He argued from the standpoint of human merit. And he was in 2 chapters, chapters 11 and 20. Okay, and then there was one more person who came on the scene. All right, he was a 4th one. The Bible didn't say whether he came with them, but apparently he heard everything that was going on. So he was a 4th one. He was connected to Buz, the second son of Nahor, who was the brother of Abraham. All right. Now he was younger than them. And so in this time, it was customary for the young men to allow, the elders to finish speaking before they began speaking. So he let them go through all of their stuff before he even said a word. All right. He was pretty frustrated with Job justifying himself rather than Job justifying God. He was frustrated with the silence of the 3 friends of Job's, the 3 I just named, because after Job kept declaring his righteousness, finally the 3 friends were like, they just sat down and was like, I'm just going to be quiet. All right. He spoke on the uprightness of God. He reminded them that no man knows God in all of his fullness. Remember, we talked about how we're finite and God's infinite. All right. And he had a lot of chapters. He was in chapters 32 all the way to 37. All right. Now, some of the purposes associated with the book of Job is giving light concerning human suffering, because sometimes we just, need a little more information. Recording the reasoning of man, because sometimes reason gets us in trouble. Identifying Satan as the author of misery. All right. Teaching patience and revealing God as the deliverer of his people when called upon in time of need. So these are some of the purposes that you can find in the book of Job. All right. And then you have some truths about Job's experience. All right. There are matters that are going on in heaven that believers, we don't have a clue about. All right. Although these things affect our lives, I'm not saying they don't affect our lives. They do. But we still may not have a clue about them. But it doesn't negate them from happening. All right. Even the best effort at explaining life sometimes can just be useless. Because sometimes we just can't explain it. It just is what it is. All right. God's people do suffer. All right. We're not about to walk through life and not suffer. God's people suffer. All right. Bad things happen to good people all the time. All right. So you can't judge a person's spirituality by their painful circumstances or whatever it is that they're going through. Nor can you judge it by their success. Neither one. All right. Even though God may seem far away, if you persevere in your faith, all right, you'll realize that God is good. All right. And you can safely leave your life in his hands. He got it. Don't worry about it. All right. So just because he seems far away don't mean he is far away. All right. Then you got the believer in the midst of suffering should not abandon God. Don't abandon God. That's the time to draw near to him. All right. Because out of the fellowship, when you're drawing near to God, you know what comes out of that fellowship? Comfort. And you don't even need an explanation. Sometimes you just need to be focused on getting the comfort. All right. Suffering may be intense, but it will ultimately end for the righteous, and God always blesses. Because sometimes the blessing may be you learned something. Sometimes the blessing may be you grew closer to God. Sometimes the blessing may be that God had to, like, put you through a little fire so he can burn some of that stuff that you didn't need off of you. So although the suffering may be intense, it's ultimately going to end for the righteous. God's going to bless you. Okay, these are questions you might ask yourself as you're reading Job. Why does Job keep serving God? He lost everything he had, and then his body was wrecked with pain and suffering. Why serve? And then you might ask, why do the righteous suffer? All right? Why do the righteous suffer? Now, one thing I want you to remember when you think about why the righteous suffer. Now, Jesus traded with us his righteousness for our sin. Okay? So I'm thinking about us now at this point. We traded. Jesus got our sin on the cross. We got his righteousness. So, funny how we want the righteousness of Jesus, but we don't want the suffering that goes with Jesus. Okay? So those are just some questions you may ask. Okay, so these are some claims in the book. Saving faith can't be destroyed, even when the incomprehensible and undeserved happen. That's what we learn from Job. Job has saving faith. All right. And even when everything he couldn't even understand, he couldn't come to any kind of conclusion of why it was happening to him the way it was and all of that. But his faith wasn't destroyed. All right. And then you also see how God proves his character to man. All right. Then you got to understand the book of Job. Here's some things you might, want to consider. You got to understand the nature of wisdom, particularly between the wisdom of God versus the wisdom of man. There's a big gap there. All right. So as you're going through Job, you may have a lot of questions and don't get it. And why? Because your wisdom only goes so far. God's wisdom is no comparison. Okay. And then you have to admit that Job and his friends lacked the divine wisdom to interpret the circumstances accurately. They thought they knew. They did. But they realized that they were not all right. All right. God asked Job 184 questions. He reminded Job that he spoke words without knowledge. He reminded Job that he confused his feelings with false statements. He called for Job to be an expositor of the acts and works and purposes of the Almighty in creation, which could be seen. So, Job, if you can tell me about these things that you can see, this creation that you can see. Because if you can't do that, how do you possibly deal with the things you can't see? Because there's a whole lot of things, that God deals with that we can't even see. And so then, there's some little information about Satan going on in this book of Job. This is the first mention of Satan by name. Okay. So in Job 1:6, when they call Satan Satan, which means adversary, that's the first mention of Satan by that name. You find it in the book of Job. Throughout Job, God is equated to deliverance. All right. Satan is equated to destruction. You got a difference between them. All right. Satan's theory was that no man serves God without personal material gain. That's what he was trying to prove to God about Job. He's only doing the way he does what he does because of material gain. All right. Satan is the prince of the air, but even there he has limited power. All right. And then at the end of Job, around book number 41, I believe it is, when God is talking about the Leviathan, Lots of scholars talk about, what this could be, who it could be. But one of the things, that if when you really look at it, you can figure out that it was symbolic of Satan because it was associated with pride. All right. And throughout scripture, pride is not associated with an animal per se. Okay. And so when it talks about being the father of pride, the children of pride, so from that, scholars have deemed that, it was symbolic of Satan. And so just a few more little tidbits of information. You have a theodicy, which is man's attempt to defend God's involvement in calamity and suffering. Okay, so you can see Deuteronomy 29 and 29 about that. That's what theodicy is about. Suffering. There is an inscrutable mystery of innocent sufferings. Sometimes we just aren't going to understand. As did Job, we have an ignorance of events that occur in heaven as it relates to our ordeal on earth. This is why his friends were ignorant about things, and then they struggled to explain things based in their ignorance. There were 74 charges against God. All right. When there is no rational or theological explanation for disaster or pain, just trust God. Trust his goodness and trust his sovereignty. Now, here's the deal. When we get all the way to the end of the book and God speaks, God still offers Job no explanations. But he did call Job into a deeper level of trust. So all the questions that Job was asking, when he was big and bold, God didn't answer those. But God did call Job. By the time we got to the end, Job had moved to a deeper place with God. All right. We must rest in faith in God's goodness and the hope of his redemption. And then they talked about this place, Sheol. That's the place of departed spirits, not the grave. Okay. Because remember, in Job's time, all souls went to a place because Christ hadn't come. All right. Now, they went to a place where they were separated. Righteous souls were here. Unrighteous souls were, not all together. But they had to go to a place until Christ came. But remember, when Christ came, it says Christ went there, liberated the righteous souls, and took them to heaven. So you see that word, throughout Job. And so as you go throughout Job, I just gave you an outline. Here's one of the outlines that it's really a good one. And people, put different spots and places in Job, but this is what I did with Job. So the first part, remember, the book begins with the scene in heaven, explains why, explains all this stuff that's happening that Job has no idea about, but we do because we're the readers. All right. So you have a dilemma that's in the first two chapters where, Job is introduced and you have these divine debates with Satan, and then you get the arrival of his friends. That's chapter 1 and 2. And there's 3 cycles of debates happening. They're from chapter 3 all the way to chapter 37. All right. Cycle 1 is chapters 3 through 14. Job has despair. Eliphaz speaks. And then Job replies to him. Bildad speaks. And then Job replies to him. Zophar speaks. And then Job replies to him. Okay. Then you get cycle 2. All right. Eliphaz speaks again. All right. Job responds to him. Bildad speaks again. Job responds to him. Zophar speaks again. Job responds to him. That's in chapters 15 through 21. All right. Then you get chapters 22 through 26. Eliphaz has his third speech. Job responds to him. Bildad has his third speech. Job responds to him. Zophar didn't even speak the third time. All right. Then you get Job has his final defense. All right. This is in 27 through 31, where Job gives his monologue of what's going on. He gives a first monologue, then he gives a second. And then finally, Elihu, because after that, it's kind of silent. So Elihu, the younger one, he pops in 32 through 37. And then finally, you get to the deliverance, 38 through 42. God interrogates Job, 38 through 41, where God responds to Job. Job answers a little, and then God responds again. And then in chapter 42, Job confesses, he worships, and he's vindicated. Job passes judgment on himself. He repents. God rebukes the three friends. Not Elihu. He only rebukes three. All right. And then God restores Job's family, his wealth, and his long life. So that is the background of Job. All right. And so the next screen recording that I'll make is basically the book of Job using, a particular topic. Because remember, there's lots of topics, but I'm going to use one particular topic. So thanks for traveling with me through the background of Job. I have enjoyed this traveling with you guys. And until our next one, happy traveling through whatever book you're traveling through. Bye.